to Workers' World newspaper for organizing this panel. And I want to thank Comrade John for that definition of imperialism going back to Lenin's very, very important work that was written during the height of World War I. I want to focus on China in terms of its foreign policy in relationship to the African continent. It's a very, very broad topic. I want to narrow it down to largely focus on an organization that was established in the year 2000, some 17 years ago, called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. Now, there's been a series of conferences involving African Union member states, the African Union being the continental organization based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It has 54 member states. It was formed in 2002. It is the successor to the Organization of African Unity, which had been formed in 1963, also in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And at the time of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, there were 32 or 33 independent African countries that came together for the purpose of building cooperation and also accelerating the process of colonialism on the African continent. Now, this series of conferences between AU member states and the People's Republic of China has highlighted the dynamic political and economic character of relations between these two geopolitical regions. As I mentioned, it's known as the Forum for China-Africa Relations, FOCAC. The organization was formed in 2000 in Beijing in the People's Republic of China. And over the last 17 years, the volume of trade taking place between the African Union member states and China has accelerated. Now, both the PRC and the African Union member states have forged stronger links since the beginning of the 21st century due to the needs of both areas. Now, China requires energy resources, they need agricultural products, they need outlets for their markets, for products. On the other hand, the African continent must find states and other entities to provide investment for infrastructure, for technological needs, scientific needs, healthcare, education, and also municipal and other services development. Now, if we look at China today, its position in the world, it's the second largest economy internationally. Now, this is absolutely phenomenal. Since the great October Socialist Revolution that took place in 1949, the country of China has been transformed from a semi-colonial, underdeveloped state to a power to be reckoned with by the imperialist powers of the United States, the European Union, as well as Japan. Africa has far more land mass than China, but they have less people than the People's Republic of China. However, the population in Africa is growing at a very, very rapid rate. Now it's approximately in excess of 1 billion people. And the overwhelming majority of people on the continent are youth. People under the age of 35 years old constitute the majority of the population. And of course, this is cause for concern by the Western European imperialist states as well as the North American imperialist countries. Nonetheless, the continent is rich in mineral and natural resources, which, if properly harnessed and utilized for development purposes, could place the African Union member states as a leading force in economic growth and consequently world politics. We saw some of this over the last decade. However, as a result of the decline in oil prices, natural gas prices, and other commodity prices, even products such as cocoa, it's sparked a renewed debt crisis in Africa that we saw in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's causing a lot of problems, even in countries like Nigeria, which is the most populated state in Africa, one of the richest in terms of sweet crude oil, also has natural gas. They're in a recession right now because of their dependency on marketing oil and natural gas to these imperialist countries. These are dependencies that were inherited as a result of colonialism. Now, the recently constructed African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, was built by Chinese architects and construction workers several years ago. People have ever seen photographs of that center. It's a magnificent infrastructure, a magnificent building built to headquarter the African Union Commission, which is like an administrative body that manages the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month affairs of the African Union, which has summits on an annual basis, at least 2 summits every year.
Where is it on this side?
It's in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That's where the AU headquarters is located. It's always been located there since 1963, but a new building was constructed several years ago by China. Now, this is a state-of-the-art facility that positions Africa for achieving unprecedented heights in the present period. Now, Chinese investment and assistance to the AU member states are based upon respect for the independence of both regions and refrains from the interference in the internal affairs of all the governments that are member states on the African continent. Now, this represents a sharp departure from the legacy of Western domination through the periods of the Atlantic slave trade that extended between the 15th century to the middle to end of the 19th century, and also after the demise of the Atlantic slave trade, the rise of colonialism, and after independence, today we have neocolonialism in Africa. Now, this is a very interesting observation from the standpoint that I was just reading a comment on an article related to China-Africa relations on yesterday, and someone had commented, after this, expose on these various joint projects between AU member states and the PRC, and the fact that China does not interfere in the internal affairs of Africa. This person commented that, well, this shows that China is supporting dictatorship in Africa. So the assumption is that all governments in Africa are dictatorships. But even the governments in Africa that are dictatorships, it is up to the people themselves on the continent to resolve those contradictions. It's not up to China to make a decision in regard to internal African politics. And how do we define dictatorship? The United States defines any country that goes against its foreign policy as being dictators or undemocratic. Even if they are dictators and undemocratic, they have a different agenda for accusing these countries of being dictatorships, and we can talk about examples of this later. Now, slavery and colonialism sought to divide African peoples and for the sole purpose of super exploitation and national oppression. Read Walter Rodney, his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and he documents, he learned Portuguese, so he was able to go to Lisbon and study in the government archives, and he documents very clearly the degree of exploitation, even the building of limited infrastructure in Africa during the colonial period and the period of slavery was specifically designed to facilitate exploitation of both natural resources as well as labor. The railroads that were built, the plantations that were built, the limited government infrastructure and services that were built were all designed to support imperialism. So this refutes this whole notion that somehow Europe, its colonization and enslavement of African people had a positive impact. Now, the false notions of benevolent intent aimed at bringing Christianity, well, the European form of Christianity, because actually Christianity was founded in Egypt. The first Christian church was formed in 70 AD by St. Mark, even prior to any church in Europe. Wasn't until the 4th century, after the Conference of Nicaea, that they broke away, from the Orthodox Christian Church to form what today is known as the Roman Catholic Church. But the Orthodox Church still exists in Egypt, and its counterparts exist in other places like Ethiopia, Russia, Serbia, and so forth. Also, they claim they brought European values to Africa, as if European values are somehow superior to African values. And trade, of course, is the same situation. But at the beginning of Western European contact with Africa in the 15th century, there was no significant gap in development between the two regions. In fact, prior to the 15th century, the center of world economic system was not in Europe, surprisingly enough. The key areas of trade and nation building were located in the Indian Ocean bases. It extended from East Africa across to certain areas of West Africa and North Africa, and across areas that are now considered the Middle East. When we say Middle East, we have to think middle from what? And also the Asia-Pacific region that encompassed areas such as China, Japan, as well as Thailand. This is prior to the 15th century. China has also been subjected to attempts at colonial domination, just like Africa, as well as enslavement. Both Britain and Japan sought to utilize China for its own benefits. Characteristic of imperialism was the conquest and the struggle that was waged against China in the 19th and 20th centuries. There was two Sino-Japanese wars at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. There was Japan, China treaty, three Japanese-China treaties in the late 19th century. Of course, there was a Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. So these processes of inter-imperialist rivalry and attempts to conquest, the Sino-Japanese wars were involving domination of Korea. And we still see that today with the division of Korea since 1945 to 1950 with the so-called Korean War. And that still goes on today. We just saw 2 months ago there was almost another outbreak of the Korean War because of Trump's saber rattling. Now, beginning in the years after the conclusion of World War II, the potential for socialist transformation through national liberation movements emerged. Now, these phenomena were manifested in Vietnam after the August Revolution that was led by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party of Vietnam. Then, of course, there was in Korea, there was the Communist Party of Korea, which later became the Workers' Party of Korea, headed by Kim Il-sung. They spearheaded the anti-Japanese liberation struggle. Korea was dominated by Japan between 1905 and 1945. And after 1945, the United States stepped in to prevent the consolidation of socialism in the Korean Peninsula, which almost took place in 1950 until they went to the UN and passed a resolution and engaged in this invasion in 1950. It was done under the banner of the United Nations. However, it was mainly the United States and Britain that did most of the fighting. 3 to 4 million Koreans lost their lives in that struggle. Kim Il-sung was a founder of the Communist Party of Korea, but he was also a member of the Chinese Communist Party. It was led by Mao Zedong. Also, the Soviet Union supported the DPRK, which was founded in 1948. So all these developments, of course, have shaped China's foreign policy and also the United States foreign policy. And we can talk about this more. I just wanted to talk about FOCAC, in the last couple of minutes. Right now, some people say that China constitutes the largest trading partner with African Union member states. Now, some people dispute this, saying it's the European Union. We can discuss this later. Just to give you an example, at the last full summit of the Forum of China-Africa Relations that was held in Johannesburg, South Africa on December 8th and 9th in 2015, approximately $35 billion in joint projects were announced. There was, about 60 billion. The disbursement of these funds included $5 billion to direct, along with the interest-free loans from China to the AU member states. There was another $35 billion allocated for what are described as preferential loans, and export credits on favorable terms, which contrasts with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and these other entities, which in fact have enslaved Africa again under neocolonialism. An additional $5 billion in capital to replenish China-Africa Development Fund. There was another $5 billion more in initial capital for special loans to small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa. Finally, there was $10 billion allocated to enhance China-Africa production capacity. They created a cooperation fund, and you can find this information on the African Union website. So these things are going on a daily basis between the two geopolitical regions. I just want to mention in closing that in the 1960s, China under Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai expressed maximum solidarity with the African Revolution. Zhou Enlai visited several African countries in 1964. He made the statement, Africa was ripe for revolution. Ruling classes, this is in 1963. John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time, according to Mao, used dual tactics. On the one hand, it continues to connive and take part in the discrimination against the African American people and their persecution, even to the point of sending in troops, which they did in Birmingham in 1963, to suppress the demonstrations. On the other hand, in the attempt to numb the fighting of the African American people and deceive the masses of the country, the Kennedy administration is parading as an advocate of the defense of human rights and the protection of civil rights of the African American people, calling upon the African American people to exercise restraint. And he also introduced the Civil Rights Bill to Congress in 1963. Amid all these mass demonstrations, he was killed, of course, in November of that year. So no such statement was ever made by any of the imperialist countries, both inside or outside the United States, since 1963. We're talking about some 54 years later. Therefore, the Chinese people have made a profound contribution to the quest for liberation and social justice for the African people, both on the continent as well as in the United States. And we can pursue this further during the question and answers. Thank you for your patience.